Russia steps up airstrikes in Syria. Opposition rebels say they're being supplied with more US-made weapons. Is the tug of war over Syria heating up between Russia and the US? And will it lead to resolution or deeper conflict? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zaidan. Syria's ever-changing battle lines became even more complex when Russia began airstrikes 2 weeks ago. Well, now it appears Russian air cover is providing an opportunity for a new ground offensive. Thousands of Iranian troops are reportedly being drafted in to fight alongside Syrian government and Hezbollah forces. But Syrian rebels say they're ready for the fight after being resupplied with US-made anti-tank missiles to help them turn the tide against the Syrian regime. Lots to discuss, but first, Zaina Khodr sets things up from Beirut.
Russia's military intervention in Syria marked a new phase. Now, while Russians calling this a war on terrorism, they haven't shied away from the fact that they are targeting other groups on the ground who they consider terrorists. Now, what is Russia's objective? Russia's objective is undoubtedly to support the Syrian government, try to change the balance of power on the ground. As of late, the government lost ground to the opposition, and its stronghold, for example, in Latakia, was under threat. Now, what has the military intervention achieved so far? It has put the rebels on the defensive. They're no longer advancing towards Latakia countryside. And really, that is where the military activity is happening right now, in a corner of Syria that links the provinces of Hama, Idlib, as well as Latakia and Aleppo. It's a very important junction. So what this objective, the objective of the military campaign is to push the rebels back and really put pressure on the rebels, because we have heard Russian officials, including the President Putin himself, say that we intervened to help, quote, the legitimate authorities in Syria with the aim of paving the way for a political solution. Now, we've seen many turning points in the conflict over the years. Whether this time around it's going to be any different, we don't know. The opposition is still promising to fight back. They're refusing to surrender. They're refusing the latest UN peace initiative. But the government is not only getting help from Russia. Now, pro-Iranian sources are making clear that thousands, not hundreds, thousands of Iranian troops are in Syria taking part in the ground operation. Really a message from Iran to the world that even though Russia may be taking the lead in this new military operation, Iran is still there, and it still has a role to play in Syria, whether militarily or whether in negotiations to find a political settlement to the conflict. Zaina Khodr for Inside Story, Beirut.
So, how are regional powers repositioning themselves for maximum influence in Syria? Well, on Tuesday, Russia's Air Force commander said 86 targets had been hit in 24 hours. That's the biggest one-day tally since its campaign started. Russia's also set up a joint intelligence gathering centre with Iraq to provide targets in both Iraq and Syria. The Syrian rebels say they've been provided with more US-made weapons, including guided missiles. I'm joined now by our guests. Joining me here in Doha is Andreas Krieg, Assistant Professor at the Defence Studies Department of King's College in London. Andreas is a Strategic Defence Analyst. And joining us from Beirut, Yazid Sayegh, a Senior Associate at the Carnegie Middle East Centre, and Sami Nader, Director of the Levant Institute for Strategic Affairs. Good to have you with us. Let's start with Andreas here in the studio. Is the tug of war picking up between Russia and the US over Syria?
Well, it's definitely picking up. I mean, we've seen over the last 4 years already kind of a surrogate war where various proxies are fighting against each other, various parties involved. It's very much a world war on a small scale within Syria.
It is, but has it really increased since the Russian intervention?
Definitely. I mean, it looks a lot more like a proper proxy war. A lot of people draw comparisons with the situation in Afghanistan in the 1980s, where the Americans were supplying the Mujahideen to fight against the Soviets. I wouldn't go that far, but still, I think we're seeing, despite operational cooperation between the Americans and the Russians, we definitely see a polarization of both camps, that the Russians are supporting and the one that the Americans are supporting. So I would very much say that this is a proxy war, especially with the 50 kilos of new weapons being dropped over rebel territory by the Americans.
Let's bring in the thoughts of our guests in Beirut. Yazid Saeed, do you agree with that perhaps the Russian airstrike campaign has become something of a turning point, at least in terms of the tension and confrontation between the US and Russia over Syria?
Well, clearly it's intensified the pressure, the strains. It poses very direct challenges to the other external powers, such as Turkey. The Saudis have been backing the armed opposition, and of course the US, which is flying over Syria to attack Islamic State targets. Whether, however, this is the trend is a bit unclear. Clearly everything's very dramatic now. It all looks like it could go anywhere. I don't think that's accurate. The Russian involvement so far is actually pretty limited, unless the Russians get drawn in to beefing up their air unit that's now in Syria of about 30 aircraft. And if, moreover, they increase their ground presence to start including combat elements, then we're
But hang on, Yazid, the Russian Air Force commander is talking about 86 targets being hit in 24 hours. That isn't significant?
That's 86 targets. It's still the same number of aircraft, and there's a big question how long the air unit that the Russians have in Syria today can maintain this pace of target sorties. I don't think this is sustainable for too long. It's increased in the last few days because of the ground offensive by regime forces in the Rad plain and Hama province. But nonetheless, as I said, it's dramatic, it's noisy, there's a lot going on. But if you look carefully at what there actually is on the ground, it's the same number of Russian forces, whether air units or ground support, etc., that they put in starting late August. Unless and until that expeditionary force is increased, then I think there's a ceiling to what the Russians actually are doing. They're getting a lot of mileage for this rather low-cost effort. If the Iranians come in with ground troops, that could start changing things. But again, I mean, if it's true that the US is going to allow guided missiles, now again, are we talking guided anti-tank missiles? Well, there's a lot of those already confronting Syrian armor in the Rab plain and pretty effectively. But whether finally the US or NATO allies are going to allow advanced guided anti-aircraft missiles into Syria, that I think is a much bigger question. If that happens,
talking of the bigger question,
you want to find out what the Russians are going to do about it.
Right. I want to focus on that question with Sami Nadir. As we've heard from Yazid, his take on it is so far we're seeing perhaps more noise from the Russians than the rhetoric would suggest. The scale of military operations. What about on the US side? I mean, there have been claims from groups like the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights saying that the flow of US-made weapons has increased, that groups are getting more guided anti-tank weapons. To what extent has the US stepped up supplies of weapons to Syrian groups?
Yeah, it seems that the Syrian opposition, are getting more arms and namely more anti-char missiles. However, I mean, because the comparison is often drawn with what happened in Afghanistan, I think the main difference with Afghanistan in terms of proxy war, that here we are in a situation whereby the American administration is very hesitant, is not determined, as it was the case during the war in Afghanistan. So at that time, the American administration was determined to send to the jihadis this kind of arm that could, at the end, destabilize the Russian presence. Here, I mean, this is not the case. But yes, we can talk about a proxy war because some regional power are really determined to face up to the Syrian regime and to Iran that is backing the regime. And in that sense, they are not seeing in good terms this presence of Russia backing up the Syrian regime and the Iranian president. And this is for them, when we talk about Turkey, about Saudi Arabia, this is very serious, because if the Russian could change the balance of power, this would mean practically that Iran would be exerting its influence all over the Levant, from Syria to Iraq, to Iran, and this is a very serious challenge to the regional power. So
right.
For them, it's a matter of survival to back up the opposition.
Andreas, you've, I'm sure, heard the reports Iran massing troops near Aleppo. Are they credible, and how much of a real attempt to change the balance of power that Sami was talking about is going on here in places like Aleppo right now through actors like Iran and Russia?
We need to differentiate between the Russian and the Iranian effort. I mean, the Iranians have...
They're not coordinated? They're not allies in this?
They're on the same side. But you would even... you can make an argument the Americans are on the same side as well, because if the Americans have to choose between ISIS or Assad, they might choose Assad as well. I mean, it's very difficult to say that there are no clear-cut allies, but I would say that the Iranians and the Russians are definitely very adamant of supporting Assad. But from an operational point of view, the Iranians have been involved in this war for much longer than the Russians. They have been not just directly, but indirectly via Hezbollah. They have had advisors on the ground, and we've seen pictures yesterday of Soleimani, who is a very senior Iranian intelligence chief, being on the ground, briefing people. Again, I don't think that the Iranians or the Russians are somewhat illusioned that they can retake Aleppo, that they can actually stabilize the north of Syria. The north of Syria is gone. It's whether to ISIS or to the rebels. It's more.
So
about
what's the point of any big battle? The propaganda is that there is a big battle looming for Aleppo right now.
Sure. It's about making sure that the Assad regime is not losing any more ground, because effectively in the south, Assad is a mayor of Damascus. In the north, they have the triangle of Idlib, Latakia, and Hama, Homs, Aleppo. This area, which is still somewhat fought over, but they need to stabilize their foothold. The regime has to.
So you don't agree with Sami's analysis here that this is perhaps an attempt to change the balance of power?
It's an attempt, but I think you have to be very illusioned to think that this is going to tip the balance of power.
Sami, coming back to you, how important would a battle for Aleppo be, perhaps for all sides, to test the extent of their reach and power in Syria, if all sides are stepping up their assistance and involvement? I mean, is this a key moment?
Aleppo is key. Aleppo is key strategically, and Aleppo as a symbol as well is key, because we are talking here about the biggest city in Syria. We are talking here about a strategic point in terms of number of dwellers and population. Aleppo is the biggest city in Syria, and plus, I mean, whoever control Aleppo have a full control all over the north of Syria. This is a continuum with Turkey, and as well, I mean, whoever take Aleppo, I mean, he's about to control the center of Syria, and in that sense, if the regime lose ground in Aleppo, he will be, I mean, isolated in the western part of Syria,
right.
And most likely he will lose the capital, Damascus.
Yazid, okay, it seems our thoughts are that Aleppo is a key battle here. Russia's obviously stepped up its intervention lately. What about US policy? Is that changing? I mean, any battle for Aleppo would pit people on the basis that are you pro or against Assad, rather than more on the question of are you pro or against ISIL. And US policy on Syria, or shall we say US military intervention at least, has been more focused on ISIL lately. Will that change as we see Russia become more active, as we see battles which are decisive for Russia's influence become more active? Will we see perhaps US assistance going to support groups that are more focused on taking out the Assad regime and their allies rather than on the question of ISIL?
You've packed a great deal into that question. I'll give you a few very brief takeaways. First is, I'm not convinced we're looking at the decisive battle of the war in Aleppo at the moment. I don't think that's on the cards. There may well be a regime offensive. There have been several since last year. Aleppo is not about to fall to either side. As your guest, Sami Nader, said, it's a large urban space. There's a massive number of people, certainly in the regime areas, in the city and in outlying countryside.
But Yazid, if it's not a decisive battle for the future of Syria, could it be a decisive battle that tests the limits of Russian influence, Iranian influence and US influence?
Of course. Look, I mean, you're setting up a hypothetical. I'm trying to say that were that to be the battle, then yes, it would be decisive and it would be the key on which everything hangs. We are not at that stage. The Russian involvement and any Iranian involvement there is so far are nowhere near the scale needed to undertake a battle for something like Aleppo, let alone decide it or emerge victorious. Neither side is able to really open that battle just now, and anything else is just talk and bravado. The situation of the opposition in Aleppo, for instance, is highly fragmented. You hear complaints almost daily from local activists and from some of the local groups, the armed groups, complaining about their inability to put a united single front together. So we're just not at that stage. This is PR. I want to go back to something that Andreas Krieg said, and in order to respond to the rest of your question, which is that at most what will come out of this, the Russian intervention and whatever the Iranians are doing, is to more or less restore the equilibrium on the ground so that the regime no longer loses territory at the rate it was losing in the last 6 months. That is about the most that's going to come out of this. Neither side has gained a decisive edge here or is about to. And part of the reason why is that the US, I see no evidence whatsoever that the US is about to change tack and start investing the sort of resources, including military hardware, on the opposition side that would be necessary to tip the balance. We are still at the stage where the US seems very reluctant to provide guided anti-aircraft missiles, even, let's say, 2 single launchers to bring down a few of the Syrian aircraft undertaking barrel bombing of civilian populations. Unless there's something, maybe even a token like that, then the Russians will understand the US still has no stomach for this kind of confrontation. The US is just not investing anything further. And all the rest of the talk about more arms supply from the Gulf or anti-tank missiles, these are already available in Syria in relatively comfortable supply, and they are not about to tip the balance. So rather more is going to be needed if people want to keep pushing up against the regime.
OK, so no major game changer in US policy there, the thoughts of Yazid. Andreas, what about Russian foreign policy and Russian policy towards Syria? Have we seen a shift there with the Russian foreign ministry talking about how it's ready to deal with the Syrian opposition groups?
Well, I mean, Russia wants to show that it's still a global player. Same situation as in the Ukraine. They want to show that they can also be a political player, not just militarily, but they can put pressure on the Assad regime. They can be a mediator. They can be an arbitrator of some sort.
But do you read between those lines, as some analysts have, or they seem to be, that there is an indication there that perhaps Russia will be willing to talk about a post-Assad era in Syria?
No, I don't think so. It will be, even if they remove Assad himself, there will be the entire system of Assad that is underneath, that is basically making up the entire bureaucracy and authority in Syria will still stay in place. I think the Russians are not ready to give that up because there's no alternative. From a Russian point of view, the alternative is ISIL, on the one hand, or moderate rebels, which they consider to be incited by the Americans, incited by the West and by its Gulf allies, because they want to have some sort of democracy. I think the Russians look at Syria in the same way that they look at Ukraine, Georgia, and all the other states. They're seeing it as a revolution that was incited by the West, because the West wants to create something that is somewhat a regime that is more likely to their foreign policy. I think that obviously that is a Russian perception, but one that might be quite difficult to change. And I think they want to make sure that you see that in Yemen as well.
So what are you saying, basically, that the Russian end goal is simply to keep Assad there for as long as possible?
Not as long as possible, but not until they will keep him as long as there is a viable, what they consider to be a viable alternative, a proper state force. Right now, Syria is widely an ungoverned space, and the Russians consider the western part, Latakia, and also the south, the only governed space, governed by the regime. They don't consider the other rebel forces, Free Syrian Army or the Syrian National Council, to be a proper authority to govern spaces, which is wrong because they've shown that they can govern spaces. But they don't consider them to be legitimate. So they say, as long as we don't have a legitimate alternative, we will stick with Assad.
One wonders, Sami Nadir in Beirut, whether at some point the US and Russian policies might converge, if that's where they seem to be heading in terms of looking for an alternative to the Assad regime at some point. Doesn't convergence become a necessary stage?
I do believe that the interests of Russia and US converge, and they are eager, both of them, to a political solution. Even the Russian, who went to this game in order to change the balance of power and in order to avoid, a strategic card they had in their hand, and this strategic asset that was about to crumble, and it was losing its value by the day. Because at the end of the day, Russia cannot withstand a protracted war in Syria. They cannot sustain it on the medium run or on the long run. So at one point, they have to broker a solution. Yes, now they went into a military operation in order to consolidate their gains, in order to bring this regime behind the table, not on the table of negotiation, because this war is different from Ukraine. Even the Ukraine war, Russia couldn't have the means to achieve it. And this war in Syria is opening the flank of Russia. It took a sectarian dimension that could put at serious threat all the strategic depth of Russia. This is one. Second, Russia doesn't have the economic mean to sustain a war for months or for years. So I won't be surprised if very shortly Russia would try to broker a political settlement or to offer a political solution for the Syrian crisis.
That's an interesting point, and I think Yazid agreed on that point, didn't you, Yazid, that Russia can't drag this out for too long. What is the US policy then? To sit back and wait until Russia reaches exhaustion? And then what?
I actually don't agree with that. I mean, hypothetically, yes. If it starts costing the Russians a lot, then people can sit back and wait for the Russians to be sort of more willing to moderate their demands for how a transition would be undertaken in Syria. But I think we're projecting our own preferences onto what we think the Russians will or should do. The point so far is, the Russians have actually been supporting the Assad regime militarily throughout the last 3 years. So it's not as if we're talking about a massive increase in cost to them. The gains they may make, so far the gains have far outweighed any cost they've invested. Let's look at the other side. Turkey is now at war with the Kurdistan Workers' Party again in Turkey. Is therefore distracted. Saudi Arabia has been undertaking an extremely costly war in the Yemen, which has forced it to draw down on its global reserves. So who exactly is hurting more? I think everyone's hurting. I think a more realistic assessment is that Russia is in a position just now to say, as your guest Sami Nadir said, I think they do want a political solution. They do want it on their terms, however, which are Assad may depart, but only after he's been part of a negotiation, is part of a transitional process, and then we reach a mechanism at the end which determines who becomes the next president. Now, that is something that the US and other Friends of Syria nations have so far rejected. So, although in theory the current risk of conflict could bring everyone to their senses and force them to sit down and talk seriously about a political solution, I think they're still too far apart on the key issue of Assad's status. Do they determine that he must leave as a pre-agreed outcome, which is what the US and others want, or what the Russians insist on, which is no, that cannot be a precondition. At this moment, reality on the ground is closer to the Russian position. The US, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and others have not yet been able to shift the balance on the ground sufficiently to force a different calculation either on the Russians or on the Assad regime or in Iran for that matter.
Right. All right.
So this is going to go on for a while.
It will go on for a while, as will our discussions. Well, we're going to have to leave it here for now. Let's thank all of our guests, Yazid Sair, Sami Nader and Andreas Krieg. And thank you for watching. As always, you can leave your comments on the show's page of our website, aljazeera.com, and you can post your views on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or tweet us at AJ Inside Story. Thanks for watching. From me, Sami Zaidan, and all the team for now, it's goodbye.